This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Born in Brooklyn, New York, of parents who came to the United States as displaced persons after World War II, Helen Charov grew up in Sea Cliff, a village on Long Island's North Shore. After graduating from New York University, she traveled extensively through the USSR with a government exhibit. She joins me today on Uncorking a Story to discuss her book, Tatiana's War, Escape and Survival on the Eastern Front in World War II. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Helen.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Helen, I'm excited to have you here, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Well, if I go back far enough, it actually goes back to my mom giving me a Royal portable typewriter when I was around 8 years old. And I proceeded to learn how to touch type. And I did a translation of a Russian children's book called Dr. Aybolit, which if you translate it, it's called Dr. Ouch, It Hurts. Now, at the time, I wasn't aware of Dr. Dolittle by an English author. So I went ahead and translated it, and I sent it off to Bennett Cerf, whom I saw on What's My Line when I was a kid, because somewhere I had read that he was at Random House. Surprisingly, I didn't get an answer back. So only later on did I learn that there was already a Dr. Dolittle, and I'm not sure. I have a feeling that Chukovsky, the author of the Russian book, probably cribbed a lot because there was a two-headed llama, and there was a talking dog, and there was a monkey and everything. But so it kind of goes back to that. But this particular book, I had an interesting life before it, but there was a knowledge. I knew that my mom was a writer, and I knew that she wrote extensive letters to her friends, and that she, kept a lot of materials that she had written earlier. And I really didn't pay attention to it until I was around 40 years old, and I had a daughter, and I realized that she was my daughter, and I was the daughter of my mother, and my mother was the daughter of my grandmother. But it coincided with a historical occurrence of the Nazi invasion of Russia in June of 1941. It's called Operation Barbarossa. And as the 60th anniversary of that was approaching in 2001, on sort of a hunch, I went back through some papers and I saw that my mother had written an article about it for a Russian newspaper the article was called The Day the War Started. And it described where she was in Russia, in Ukraine, as a mother of two children. And the day the war started is the day that she has to get on a train and go pick up her daughter in Odessa. So on a complete sort of hunch, I sent off a query to National Public Radio saying, hey, you guys are probably going to cover Operation Barbarossa in some way. Here's this article that my mother wrote, first person account, real person, a woman who's suffering through what's going to be World War II. And to my surprise, I got a call a couple of weeks back, and I was actually interviewed by Scott Simon of Saturday Weekend Edition on the article. And I read a part of it. I read part of the translation. They did a really nice job with sound effects, train in the background. But he also asked me a couple of questions about what was my mother's life like. And I think that this book really kind of started on that day because I realized that she probably had some other ideas and some other articles about her life in Russia. So I would say that the genesis of this book really starts back then when I found her article and I was first interviewed by Scott Simon.
Well, I'm curious to know more about what happens after that. But you mentioned something that piqued my interest a little bit, which was you mentioned having a very interesting life before this. Can you just share a little bit more about your life?
Oh my God, what a checkered history. Well, after in your introduction, you mentioned that I went to Russia with an exhibit in 1975 after graduating from NYU. I ended up, as a New Yorker, I ended up moving to Connecticut because I married a Navy guy stationed at the submarine base here in Groton. And I went through a cycle of startup companies that he and I started after he got out of the Navy with in the heyday of the 1980s when anything that moved was getting venture capital and new technologies and the Apple first came out and then Windows came out. So I have quite a background in startup companies. Um, but my final gig was really working for a nonprofit organization that encouraged children to become entrepreneurs. So I figured, okay, I hadn't become the next Steve Jobs, but I could help other kids get started with that. So before I retired, I was the executive director of a nonprofit called the Connecticut Invention Convention. Maybe you even went through it because we had a number of schools in Stamford and Fairfield County that are still doing the program.
It's not ringing a bell to me, but I probably wasn't smart enough back in the day to go through something like that.
No, it was the kids who weren't smart because they finally found a calling by being able to do something that the A students weren't able to do as well, which is use their creativity to solve a problem, come up with an invention, build the invention, and present it. And seeing some of these kids blossom through that process was really very gratifying.
Very cool. I'm curious. You mentioned, after graduating, kind of going through the USSR. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's also featured in the book as a chapter. Um, you may remember back in the days of Khrushchev and Nixon, there was a kitchen debate that they had in an exhibit in Moscow. Well, this wasn't the one, but this was a similar exhibit that went to Tashkent, to Baku, to Moscow, to Leningrad, and to Kiev. It was a 20,000 square foot exhibit that showed the American home. It was called Technology in the American Home. And recent college grads like myself who were fluent or had learned Russian were used both as the mounters of the exhibit. So we had to go and put up the panels and everything. And then for 8 hours a day, about 10,000 Soviet people would come through this exhibit and ask us questions about. I was in the children's room, and there was a kitchen, and there was a modern kitchen, and there was a living room. And the questions would be everything from, do Americans really have a house like this? And why do you use so much plastic? To some provocative questions like, why do you lynch your Black people? And why are you in Vietnam? This was 1975. So while we were there, we were watching the evacuation from Hanoi. But it put us in touch with real people in the Soviet Union, not just the ones that were assigned to us at the exhibit, but people who were really interested in being friends and being across the ocean friendships with Americans. And of course, college students are allowed to say pretty much whatever they want. So it gave us an opportunity to show what freedom of speech was too. It forever changed me, Mike, because when I first landed in Moscow, here was this beautiful red square. It's snowing. People are walking around speaking the language that was my first language. It's a storybook situation. But I found that after being there for almost a year, that I was desperate to come home to America, to my homeland. Oftentimes they would ask me, um, don't you want to come back to your homeland? Meaning, oh, you're of Russian descent. Don't you want to come back to Russia? And would be, yes, I want to go home to America because I didn't have really that much in common with the Soviet person. I was much more of an American, grew up in America, went to American schools, graduated from an American university. So I've always had this kind of ethnic schizophrenia. A part of me, you see that portrait back there, that's Tolstoy. A part of me is Russian culture, Russian music, Russian language. But my brain is really devoted to America, to uh, independence, to freedom, choose to do what you want to do, to start your own companies, to go wherever you want to go. So this conflict has always been something that I've tried to reconcile. And in fact, I try to reconcile it in the book too, but the conclusion I come to is not one that I would have expected in 1975.
Was that the first time you had been to the USSR, or had you
Yes,
been before? Okay, so what I mean,
first
just
time.
thinking about the USSR that your mother, I'm sure, may have spoken about. How was it once you landed and were there? What was your take? Was it similar to what your mother was may have spoken about, or was it, did it catch you off guard?
Well, in some ways, it was certainly what I had expected because, I grew up on Russian fairy tales. I grew up on Russian music. I spoke Russian before I spoke English as a child. I was brought up in the Russian Orthodox Church. So there was that part of me, almost kind of you might want to call it the Russian soul of me that she had managed to embed. Um, and she still preserved it. She came to the United States when she was 39 years old, and she never really became an American this in the sense of many other immigrants become that. They learn English, they become involved in the American communities they live in. She and a lot of Russians that I grew up in Seacliff, which was always a little enclave of Russianness, she never really quite gave up her Russianness. So she was so happy that I was going back to where she had grown up, but it was almost as if she was in denial to all the things that happened to her in Russia when she was growing up. The famines, the repression, the investigations, the war, the occupation, um, then being then being pursued by the Soviet Repatriation Committee to try and bring her back to Russia. It's not that she wasn't aware of all of that bad stuff, but she tried to extract only the stuff that she thought was beautiful and wonderful about the Russian culture. I mean, she could recite all of Alexander Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin. It's about 120 pages long poem. She could recite that by heart. So that was the kind of upbringing I had in conflict with, America, which is apple pie, 4th of July, independence, freedom, freedom in many ways that she couldn't really even sanction when it came to some things. But so it was not the same experience that she had in Russia by far. It was an American visiting in Russia, is what it
Yeah.
turned out to be for me.
So I mean, you're there in 75, the mid 70s. And I'm
Yep.
thinking to myself, I'm a child of the 80s, growing up on, all the action movies we had. And of course, one of the biggest themes, from my childhood was like the Cold War, the United States versus the USSR and all the movies that I had seen where we were kind of
Yep.
pit against each other. Did you bring any of that with you on your trip? I mean, obviously not the 80s stuff because it hadn't happened yet, but that
Right.
tension between the US and the Soviet Union?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, while we were there, I would say that there was less tension then than there is now, to tell you the truth. I mean, there was still this sense of cooperation, especially in space. There was a cooperative meeting of Soyuz and Apollo, I think, in 1975. A handshake. Everybody sort of cheered it in Red Square and everything. And Russians, quite honestly, they loved Americans because they loved our frankness and they loved our friendliness. You Americans are always smiling everywhere, is what they would say. But there was still obviously the differences between a capitalist society and a socialist society. It wasn't quite achieved communism. But I'll give you an example. The kids would come up to me and say, "Oh, I love your jeans. Do you like Deep Purple? I would take your jeans, please. Can I buy your jeans?" And I'd say, "Well, you can't really buy the jeans here. Maybe if you come to the United States, you could get a pair there." And they say, "No, I don't want to go to that capitalist hell." But they like Deep Purple.
Well, I mean, who doesn't like Deep Purple? I mean, there were so many different incarnations of that band. Richie Blackmore is a master on the guitar.
You're taking me back almost 50 years, having been there in 1975. I've been there since then, though, a lot. So,
Well, I want to come back to your additional trips there, but I do want to go back and talk about Tatiana's war. So it sounds like the genesis of it starts with the 60th anniversary uh, of the Nazis invading that part of the Soviet Union. So how did it come from? How did it go from finding that article to then putting it into a book? Did you find anything else of your mother's along the
yes,
way?
yes. Well, I stopped doing translations with her of her articles that I had known about because she got very uncomfortable at one point and was like, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Well, it's a great story. You're a good writer and you're a first person account of what it was like to be in Russia at the time." But I had to obey her wishes of not going any further once we'd gotten to a certain part of her life where she was living under Nazi occupation. And it was a couple of years later that I actually went up to the attic in our home here and I found a typewritten manuscript of hers. It wasn't really a manuscript, it was just single spaced pages. So I should have, it's flying right over there. I should have shown it to you. Of her life that she had sat there pecking away on her typewriter for I don't know how long, that actually chronicled the moments in her life that were of interest. And she says in the preface, as I repeat in the book, probably no one will ever be interested in this, and it'll go by the way of all things that are forgotten in life. And I came across this and I started reading it and I realized that there was just this incredible first person account of what it was like to grow up in Russia in the 30s, to become a teacher, to get married, to be involved, to suffer under Stalin's regime. And then after the invasion of the Nazis in 1941, what it meant to survive that. So I started translating it without her permission. But she died in 2006. And as much as I had wanted to get her buy in on it, I decided, well, she's not going to say no to me at this point. And I started putting it together in the form of both translations of her journals as well as my perceptions seen through the prism of an American woman who was actually finding all of this about her Russian mother years after she had written it. So I kind of the book goes between me and her in terms of translating her life up to the moment when she actually comes to the United States and, is an immigrant in Brooklyn. And gives birth to me, her final fourth child. That wasn't exactly a great time for her to have another child, but I was grateful to her that she persisted and that I came into the world. I had really wanted to write the book in time for her to appreciate it, to sort of see that there was value in telling her story, but that wasn't to be.
Yeah. Do you think she ever meant to publish it? Because I'm thinking, writing it, typing it out, um, you know, people just don't necessarily type something out unless they intend to do something with it. Do you think that, if you had to get inside her head, that she would be upset of you doing what you did?
I think she may be. Well, she typed everything. She typed her letters to her friends. She typed poems that she wrote. She typed um, uh, articles, the ones that she had published. Um, I don't think that she would have been. She would have wanted to publish this because she always felt that there were moments in her life. The way that she actually survived the Nazi occupation. Um, she was a teacher of German in Ukraine. She knew the German language. So when the Germans occupied her town of Donetsk, a name that's familiar now, she was starving to death with her children and her mother and her aunt. And the German commandant at the headquarters there said, "Well, you can starve to death, or you can come and work for us as a translator." So she made the decision, which was described in her memoirs, to go to work for the Germans. And I think that fact probably would have kept her from what is why she did not want me to continue with the translations, so that she felt that she was in a way a collaborator by saving herself and her children and her aged mother. Her aunt had died the day before in a horrible death of starvation. And although, I mean, myself, I would have been more than just a translator for the Germans if it had meant that my children would survive. But for her, it always an act was always an act of betrayal of her country in some way, even though my father, whom she met in Germany already after the war, said, "Look, Tanya, you did what you had to do." But for her, it was not something that she wanted to have known. So I don't think that she would have had it published herself. No.
Yeah. Do you think she ever forgave herself for doing that? I mean, not that one has to forgive themselves for keeping their family alive. But I understand that the weight of that choice, may have had on her, especially kind of looking back in history. Um, do you think she ever? Do you think she died with any sense of forgiveness?
No, I don't think so. I think we all tried to convince her that we were all alive and here, and she lived a very full and happy life in America, traveled, saw her grandchildren, even great grandchildren. Um, but I think her love of patria, there's a certain allegiance in Russians that completely transcends politics. It's just this love of Mother Russia. And of course, politicians like Stalin and Putin and the others use that to be able to persuade the Russian people to do what needs to be done. But I think her love of Russia probably weighed heavily on her, that she had maybe not betrayed her country, but hadn't sort of stuck it out the way other Russians alongside of her had. But she certainly didn't. She certainly didn't regret coming to the United States because she was able to have a reasonable life. She may not have agreed with everything in politics. She was staunchly against the war in Vietnam because she didn't want my brother to be drafted and go there. And of course, war for Russians is anathema after World War II, where they lost 20 million people during the war. One out of every four soldiers in the Russian army was killed, many of them in Stalingrad, which was only 400 kilometers away from her. But She was a conflicted person all of her life, I think.
Yeah. But it's not like all Russians are speaking German now, right? So it's not like
Exactly. Exactly. Right.
they
Right.
didn't win. So it's like
No. No. No.
um so tell me about sort of going from manuscript to published book here. What was that journey like for you? Sort of kind of translating your mother's basically your mother's memoir, adding to it, and then getting it out into the world.
Well, for many years, I kind of trundled along, as John Lennon says, life is what happens when you're planning it, or some paraphrase of that. So by the mid 2000s, I was a single mom. I had jobs, I had responsibilities. So it was definitely a back burner, and my mom was still alive. But I think at some point in my life, when I was nearing retirement age, I decided, well, I've got to give this a real college try. And I actually retired from my job with the intent of giving it my full attention. And I went to a workshop run by a very talented woman here in Connecticut, Jan Cardis of Black Hawk Literary Agency. And as fate would have it, she introduced me to her partner, Barbara Ellis, who knew a lot about World War II fiction and nonfiction and had worked with a couple of authors there also. And just on a single description of what I was doing and what I had done, by that time I had probably written about 50 to 100 pages of it. She said, I really think you have something here, Helen. Let's work together on this. And that was in 2017, no, 2016, the end of 2016. And I retired at the end of that year and decided I was going to just commit myself full time to doing as much as I could with this book. So Barbara and I worked on it for probably upwards of a year. She's an excellent editor, not just an agent. And after a year or so, she started sending it around to publishers, and we weren't finding anybody who really was interested in the story until McFarland Publishing came along. They do a lot of World War II. They're kind of a quasi-academic, but also a commercial publisher. So they took an interest in it, and I was able to sign a contract with them 2 years ago. They had warned us that it may take a while, but they were really, really good about working with me on the manuscript itself. And the photographs in it are there's like 40 photographs in here, and they are just so vivid. I had a friend of mine who's a professional graphics person put together put together the photographs. I mean, I don't know if you can see it here, but that's a picture of my mom in a classroom in a displaced persons camp in Germany where she met my father. So the book came out on October 30th, and I've just been so overwhelmed by the reaction to it. I mean, people I don't even know are buying 4 or 5 copies on it after reading it. That I just wish my mom and my sister, who went through all of this with her also. My sister just died a year ago. I wish they were around to see this, because I think that they would. I think finally my mother would say, "Okay, all right, Lalichka, you did a good job with this." I think one of the reasons that I wrote the book was I wanted her to be proud of me.
Isn't it interesting that no matter how old we get, we always want that, right? We always want our parents to be proud of us.
Yes, that's for sure. And when I was growing up, oh, I want you to be a doctor, because that's what she always wanted to be. Or, okay, I want you to be a translator because that was linguistic. I want you to be a writer, although, she was so well read. I mean, Tolstoy, my grandfather knew Tolstoy personally, and obviously, that kind of culture in her life, even throughout the Soviet hardships and days and everything stayed with her. A book was the most prized possession you could have. I remember as a child, my brother and I were allowed to take down these books from her library. She had an extensive library, and dust off the tops of the books and then put them back in place because they were almost revered like artwork or something. So I do think that as I was growing up, I felt we had a lot of conflict, she and I, in my teen years and everything, and we were estranged for many years. But I think that one of the things I never lost track of was that I wanted her to approve of me. I wanted her to say, yes, you've done a good job with this. And yes, yes, I love you. So that was probably an inner reason for me writing the book, even more so than just it's a great story. It's an amazing, amazing story of a woman's perseverance under the harshest of circumstances. But between me and her, I think I was looking for an approval that maybe never really came, but that I had hoped that I would achieve through this book.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And it sounds like you're getting some very positive feedback on it, even though it's only been out for not even a month now. But it
Nope.
sounds like the praise is coming through.
Well, I'm encouraged because I think it's more than just a story. It's not just another immigrant story, come to Brooklyn and stay on in America. But I think there's some historic value to it. There's not much in terms of first person accounts of what it was like to grow up in Russia and certainly during the war. And she's such a vivid writer. There's so much cinematic value in it where it's just grabs people and wants them to continue reading the book. That I'm kind of surprised and overwhelmed by the response to.
Well, speaking of cinematic, it sounds like it's not out of the realm of possibility that somebody might pick this up and make it a little bit more cinematic just by the way you're describing it.
Well, we'll see. I fulfilled the part of it that I wanted to do. If I'm not a screenwriter, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, this is my first book. I've never been published anywhere else before. Um, I don't think newbies like me really get that kind of opportunity. But, I should lean on my American optimism versus my Russian negativism. There's a saying in Russia, no good will ever come from this. That's kind of the operating mentality of Russians. Well, I'm quite the opposite. I think my American upbringing was, you can do this, go for it. Scarlett O'Hara said, I'm going to live another day, So, who knows? Nothing's out of the realm of possibility, but, I ain't getting any younger either.
Well, and one way I get to know my guests a little bit more is by asking a couple of questions around pop culture. And I'm curious, when you were growing up as a kid in Brooklyn or Long Island, what were some of the things you'd like to watch on TV if you did watch anything on TV?
Well, this is really going to date me, but of course there were the Well, first of all, there was Captain Kangaroo with his jingling pocket full of his keys and stuff, and Green Jeans and Mr. Bunny Rabbit when we were growing up. No Sesame Street, Captain Kangaroo. And then later on, there were Sky King and Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons and see, I did my homework. I heard you ask this question before of other people too. So I was prepared, had to go back in the memory to remember some of it. And then, of course, later on, MASH, wonderful program. So in my childhood, they really were the sitcoms that were popular at the time.
So I have a fun fact about Captain Kangaroo, which has never
What's
come up
that?
on this show because no one's ever mentioned him. But he was my aunt's uncle or something
No
like that.
kidding.
This is
Oh my
something that's
goodness.
a I'd have to ask my dad the exact relation, but this is my dad's brother's wife, so no blood relation. But apparently, yeah, he was related to my aunt Peggy, who just passed away earlier this year.
Oh
Um,
my gosh. Robert
yeah.
Keeshan.
Yeah, Bob
Right,
Keeshan. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right,
Grew up in somewhere in New York. Because my
right,
my my aunt
right.
was grew up in New Rochelle. So also they were good friends with oh God, who was a big baseball player? Uh, my cousin would kill me if I didn't remember this fact.
Joe
Um,
DiMaggio?
may have been either Joe DiMaggio, who was it? Mickey Mantle, maybe. Um,
Oh,
they were like
okay.
neighbors or something in Westchester County, and he used to like do odd projects for them uh, because when they weren't playing baseball, they needed to make money somewhere, so they would do like random jobs. This is the days before baseball players got paid, big bucks for sitting on the bench. But
Hmm.
very cool. How about music? What'd you like listening to growing up?
Well, that was kind of a blend because by the time I was interested in music, of course, the Beatles, and before that, Led Zeppelin. But the 60s were such an era of protest that I really I really sang along to and was even in a trio that sang protest songs along the lines of Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary. I remember being very affected by the March on Washington and have them sing blowing in the wind and go tell it on the mountain. So folk was a big part of the 60s for me. And then in the 70s it was certainly, more popular music.
Yeah. It's funny. My cousin Terry was in a folk band in the 60s
Really?
and 70s. Yeah. Her last name was Huxtable. And my goodness, what was the name of her band? Was Huxtable something and something. It was a trio. They made like three albums, and
Wow.
then they called it quits after that. She became a teacher. But I love that era of music. I love Bob Dylan, his early stuff especially. He's got a new
Yeah.
biopic. There's a new biopic coming out on him. I can't remember. I think it's maybe Timothy Chalamet who plays him. I'm not 100%
Really?
sure, but
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
I'd have to pray to Our Lady of Google to answer that question. But I saw a clip and he looked pretty good. Like, and he sounded like
Oh.
them, and he did the thing with the voice.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wasn't as musical as, say, Ian and Sylvia, Canadian group, or Peter, Paul and Mary, which did three-part harmony. My brother played in a rock band, so he played guitar. So he would switch back and forth between folk and rock and everything. So it was definitely a sign of the times back then.
Yeah, well, the thing is, like Dylan didn't have your classic great voice,
No.
or even guitar ability, but his lyrics were so
Yeah.
good. I mean, unmatched as a lyricist, and
Oh, for sure.
wrote many songs for other people as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to think of the one that was the most famous anti-war song that he did. The times they are changing, I guess.
Mm, a great song, great song.
Yeah, yeah,
How about if you can go back in time and I believe you said you got a typewriter when you were 8 years old. If
yeah.
you could go back in time and whisper something into the young 8-year-old ear, who's probably playing with that typewriter, writing Doctor Doolittle Part Two. What? what?
Doctor,
What?
ouch! It hurts.
That's right. What would you tell a younger
The
Helen?
8-year-old. Oh, I guess I would tell the 8-year-old that don't ever doubt the fact that you're loved. I mean, it was tough when I was a child because there was joking about, oh, the stork shouldn't have really brought you or something like that. And when we would visit the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and there would be a stuffed stork, there were comments about the stork and everything. So, to answer your question, I wish I had just had more self confidence in the affection that my mother and my father also was much more affectionate than my mother. But I think in speaking to parents who are in any way withholding unconditional love for their children, it's like, no, don't ever do that. Don't make it conditional on anything. So I wish I had felt that unconditional love earlier because I wouldn't have doubted it for so many years in my life.
Yeah, it's a tough one to hear. I remember like my brother and I, so we're twins, and there's a 7-year and 9-year age difference between us and our older two siblings. And they always told us that we were the surprise. We weren't planned. It was like Like, it sounds funny, but yeah, kind of thinking about it through my 50-year-old, lens, I'm like, oh, that may not have been the best message to hear when I was younger. It's
Yeah.
like, wow, did you not want me here? I mean,
Yeah. It kind of drops in on you. How are you with, you have 3 daughters, I think? You said you have
I
triplets?
have two girls and a boy. So the triplets are 2 girls and a boy. They're closer to 23 now than 22, but
Are they unconditionally loved?
they are. I have to say they are.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
and I hope they know that.
Mm-hmm.
Kids, if you're listening, I love you unconditionally.
But that's okay. I think I learned it. My sister last year before she died said, "Don't ever doubt that she loved you." She read the book before she died because she figures in it so much. I mean, she was 6 years old when the war with Germany started, so she remembers all of that. And she was so happy to come to the United States. They came across on a Navy ship, and everybody else was seasick. But she was 16 years old, and she says, I danced every night upstairs with the crew of the ship, and I was so happy that we were on our way to America. And she had a really wonderful, interesting life here in America, very, very positive about it. But when she died at the age of 88 last year, she said, don't ever doubt it. Don't ever doubt that she loved you. And that was important to me.
Yeah. Well, Helen, where can people learn more about you? Do you have any social media that you're active on, or a website that we can point people to?
I do. I just this week put up a Facebook page devoted to the book, and the Facebook page is titled Tatiana's War. So there's some extra, there's a map there of my mother's travels. There's some information there on where to purchase the book. And I'm planning to put up additional photographs and some other mementos that I have. So the best place to probably reach me is through the Facebook page for Tatiana's War.
All right. I'll be sure to find that, put it in our show notes so our listeners can find it easily. And
That'd be great.
I would say, Helen, thank you so much for stopping by, uncorking a story, and letting me uncork yours.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure talking to you, Mike.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.